And so you can see that our classroom today is the United States of America from sea to shining sea. And of course we have our participant here from Swansea University from Cardiff, Wales. I actually have never talked to him, but one day I'm going to track him down, and he has signed up for every session we've had for the past 3 months, so he must be really interested in invasive species, so I hope to get to talk to him personally someday. So, as I've said before, there's two primary lines of defense against the introduction and establishment of invasive species. The first one is the port of entry, and we have, I think, something on the order of maybe 57 of these ports, and I'll have to verify that, but I know there's a number. A number of ports in all the coastal areas where we have ports. We have port of entries with Customs and Border Patrol folks who are involved there. With exclusion, when I was working in APHIS until as a port inspector, I think we had about 3,000 inspectors. So that's one thing that I would encourage you to pass the word along. It's really the foundation of teaching me everything that I know about invasive species today. That was the beginning of it, because when I started my career, I'd already been a teacher for a year, a high school teacher. Then I got that job in the Port of Charleston. But I got to tell you, up to that time, in a master's program in biology, at least at the University of South Carolina, I don't know about other colleges perhaps, they were not talking about invasive species. They did not talk about these things in the context of being invasive. We saw all these things on our field trip, like Chinese tallow, Japanese stilt grass, Johnson grass, you name it, we saw it. And they would say, well, this is a plant from China or Asia or Europe or somewhere, but they never once said, well, this is a weed. So it's clear that our view of this has evolved over the past 30 to 40 years. Now, I think if you went and took a class in ecology now, or botany, my wife teaches botany here at our college, Southeastern Community College. She talks about invasive species every day in that class. So if she sees wisteria, which is blooming right now in our area, then she talks about the history of it being introduced and it being an invader. Anyway, the first line of defense is the port of entry, and so we have the Port of Charleston, and we also have a port in Georgetown. There's nobody actually was stationed there when I was there. I don't think they are now. Well, they actually have ships come in. So if you're a port inspector, you go up there and on assignment for the day and help them clear. You go with Customs, Immigrations, and Agriculture inspectors and do a border clearance for the ship coming in from overseas. In North Carolina, we have the Port of Wilmington here. And there's a big controversy right now because a lot of folks want to put a super port here, which means they need to dredge out the area down here at the mouth of the Cape Fear River, which comes down through here. And they want to make it deep enough so that these huge ships that, instead of having 1,000 containers on them, they could have like 2,000 containers on it. But to handle something that big, you've got to have much deeper waterway. And so when they come through the Panama Canal, they come up here. These super ships, these super freighters, are going to have to go to a place like Miami or perhaps Jacksonville, Florida maybe, or Norfolk, Virginia, where they can actually get into the port. And so there's a lot of folks here who would like to have a port for North Carolina that is going to be able to accommodate these big ships. But there's also people that live right here in the town of Southport, which is right down in this area at the mouth of the river. They're completely against it. And I always say to these people, well, most of them are retired, and Southport, if you ever go visit, it's a really nice little town. It's like what Charleston might have been maybe 80 or 100 years ago. It's small, very pleasant place to visit. They don't want it to turn into a super center like Norfolk or Charleston. So I am hoping that someday they'll realize is that if we don't have a big port here, and those ports can't get up the river to go to Wilmington, which is up here, this map is actually wrong. Wilmington's over here on the river, right here, the port of Wilmington right there. So that dot should be over there. Then we're going to miss all this freight and cargo coming in from overseas. It's going to go to Charleston or Norfolk or someplace else. So people don't really understand that North Carolina would have what I would consider to be a minor port. And so I'm hoping that these people down here that are so against creating a port to accommodate the big freighters that are coming in the future, that they'll understand that it will affect the North Carolina economy. One last thing before I actually get into the details today is I remember when Dr. Epley, Bob Epley, who I worked for here at the Whiteville Center for 15 years, his brother used to sell plywood up in Charlotte. And he would import the Luan lumber as part of what he would sell in his business up there in Charlotte from South America, tropical lumber. And he always had it come in at the Port of Charleston rather than Wilmington. It wouldn't be as much of an issue now, but he said it was so much easier for a truck to get this, pick up this wood down here at the Port of Charleston, go up I-26 to Columbia, Interstate 26, and then go up I-77 to Charlotte. Because for most of that time now, US 74 from Wilmington up here to the Charlotte into the mountains is 4 lanes all the way now, but you still have a number of stoplights that are there. But at the time, so transportation folks are always looking for a way to get their cargo from point A to point B. And so Charleston was, not that it was strategically located, but it was the inland transportation system that just could not accommodate, in Wilmington, just could not, the roads could not accommodate the trucks like they could out of Charleston. All these things have a bearing on what shows up in our ports of interest. Very interesting in terms of the economy of our bi-state area here, and so the Port of Charleston is way ahead right there in terms of accommodating these ships that are going to be coming in the future. I don't know if they're going to dredge out their harbor there, but we certainly hope Wilmington is going to step up and find a way to accommodate the ships. Otherwise, the ships are going to go somewhere else, the big ships at least. As I said, in 1986, after working in Charleston 7 years, I came up here to North Carolina and started working at the witchweed eradication laboratory here in Whiteville, and we started working on lots of other programs like witchweed across the country, and I've talked about these in my other webinars if you've heard about them. But this is where I learned about excuse me, the EDRR is the second line of defense against invasive species. So we got the first line of defense at the port, and the second line of defense out there is trying to get people to detect and eradicate new invasive species before they get established and start to spread. So the goal here is to create good links between the people that work in the ports and the people that work, for example, in the witchweed eradication program up here inland in the Carolinas. To put it all in perspective, this is what we're talking about. If you are Steve Manning, you're working on that last line of defense. The third line of defense is control, and this is where we spend most of our money, and this is where we're losing so much money because we're having to do so much of this. And it's an accumulation of hundreds of years of allowing these things to come in and get established. So we have about, it's costing us something on the order of about $35 billion, $36 billion a year to because of invasive species in the United States, and about 2/3 of that is attributed to introduced species that came here, that either accidentally or on purpose, but we've ignored these things. Second line of defense is early detection and rapid response. That's like the witchweed eradication program. First line of defense is really what we're talking about in this series, which is pest-free production of commodities overseas, pre-clearance of commodities at ports of export, and exclusion of foreign pests at our ports of entry, like in Charleston, South Carolina, and Wilmington, North Carolina. That's our first line of defense. And we have had these crop protection strategies in place for a long time, ever since the passage of the Plant Quarantine Act of 1912. The U.S. Federal Noxious Weed Act was passed in 1974. It gave us our first real authority to deal with the introduction of invasive plants, of which we have now about 200 species on that list. In 2000, they passed a bill that encompassed all of the laws together, like Plant Quarantine Act, Organic Act of 1944, Plant Pest Act of 1957, Federal Noxious Weed Act of 1974. They put them all together in one law. And I imagine they're really just simply parts of that big law. I don't think anything was really changed except to say we have one big Plant Protection Act of 2000 in which we have the authority for everything under one law with different regulations for insects, diseases, weeds, and things like that. So what I'm going to talk about today is going to be the principles of pest risk analysis, the decision-making tools for deciding how to deal with foreign pests at ports of entry. So we're going to take a look at the principles of pest risk analysis. We're going to learn about the traditional prohibited listing approach that's been used in our country ever since the beginning, ever since the Plant Quarantine Act was passed in 1912. We're going to learn about the new permitted listing approach for invasive species. It was actually pioneered by the Australian quarantine inspection system in the mid-90s. And we're going to talk about a weed risk assessment exercise, which I'm going to invite you to do. And if you want to do one, then I can send you the pest risk process or template that I used for Beach Vitex in 2006 and see what you come up with. Anyway, all of this is based in large part on the fact that a man named Mark Williams from the United Kingdom had done some research throughout his career and lifetime. And they have what's called the Williams Rule of Tens for invasive species. So basically he says 10% of all introductions are going to establish casual populations outside of cultivation. That's like 100 out of 1,000 things. If you import it, you're going to see it outside somebody's yard or out somewhere in the woods or in our fields. 10% of the casual populations are going to become naturalized. That means they're going to be there. They're going to be there permanently. So that's like 10 out of 1,000. So 10% of the naturalized species are going to become invasive. That's what he said. So anybody that wants to import something, really the odds are on their side that it won't become a problem. And so you can't say that everything that we want to bring in this country is bad. And I would never say that. I would never agree to that. But I would say that when you get that one species out of 1,000, you have created a major problem. And as I said earlier this week in my other EDR seminar, I want to invite you, if you haven't done it, to get a copy of Rod Randall's book, The Global Compendium of Weeds. You can get this for free. Just type a Google search for Global Compendium of Weeds. And this is a PDF publication you can get from the website of the Western Australia Department of Agriculture. It won't cost you anything. Now, I've got a copy of it right here on my computer, but I'm never going to print it because it has like 1,200 pages in it. So this lists 33,759 weeds of the world. So when we're talking about 1 out of 1,000, the first thing I would do in determining whether something is going to be a problem here is go get this book. If you don't have it, you need to get it and put it on your computer so you can use it. These are things he has citations for every one of these things. It's not just hearsay. So it's not like you've got to start from scratch. Rod Randall has been compiling this list of invasive plants known around the world throughout his career. So here we have the Williams Rule of 10. Rule of 10s for invasive species. Now, in terms of what we can do about controlling the introduction of invasive species, there's a number of things we can do if we want to. First of all, we can do nothing. And this is really what they did until 1912. They did nothing. And so what I would say is this is ecologically and economically reckless. Just let them all come in and let it sort of settle out where it is. And that's not going to happen because we've had too many problems with things like foot and mouth disease, etc., that have caused too many problems in the past. I remember in one of my training sessions in APHIS, they were talking about why we regulate meat coming from overseas, and they said, I believe it was 1929, when they had a number of outbreaks of foot and mouth disease in California among cattle and swine pigs. And they traced it back to the fact that the farmers had gone to the ports of San Francisco, and I believe it was San Francisco, and they had gotten the garbage off ships, which they gave them freely. It turned out that that garbage from the ships had meat in it that was infected with foot and mouth disease virus. And so that's where it came from. And that's one reason they started regulating garbage on ships. And if you remember, one of the slides in Steve's introductory slides right before I started here showed a guy at a port with 3 big garbage cans, and they had lids on them. And there's a reason they have lids on them, and it's because they don't want birds to get into the garbage on ships and to take it away like a piece of meat, then go land in somebody's pig pen, and suddenly you have foot and mouth disease that even a bird could spread. The second thing you could do would be to prohibit all planned introductions. And I'll be the first to say this is not practical. It is not sustainable. Nobody's going to go along with it, socially and politically. That's just a non-starter from the beginning. Or you can assess the risks to determine the conditions of entry. In other words, you look at all the containers on this ship, and I don't know how many are there. You can sit and count it, but there may be 800 or 900 containers right there. And that's pretty amazing, isn't it? That they can go from China, from Shanghai to San Francisco or Charleston. And imagine the amount of fuel oil it takes to get there. And one other thing I wanted to say about all this, every time I see a picture like this, I'm thinking about the diesel fuel or the fuel oil it takes to get this commodities from China to here. So actually, every time I go in Walmart, I think of this picture right here, because I realized that without the oil or some other way to get this here, that suddenly China no longer has a competitive advantage over us in terms of the cost of labor. So I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but right now we're faced with, until something changes and we start building things ourselves, we're faced with continual introductions of invasive species from overseas in every one of these containers. If you think about it right there, 800, 900 chances right there. And if we're about 5% effective in doing this job at the port of entry, that means most everything is going to get past us no matter what we do at the port of entry. So you want to increase the chances that you're going to have a system that's going to recognize those things like meat having foot and mouth disease or something like that. And so that's what pest risk assessment is all about. And I think that you're trying to increase your chances of just being successful. The fact that we can't inspect everything and test everything to find whether it is pest-free is not practical. So that's what pest risk assessment is all about. So the main authority, other than our own individual national and state laws that gives us authority to do this is we signed a treaty in 1952 called the International Plant Protection Convention. It was created by the United Nations and FAO, and the United States is an original signatory of this thing. The primary goal of this treaty is to prevent the introduction of invasive species, plant pests, and weeds, as well as to regulate the vectors of these things. So now, as of last year, you can actually look this thing up on the internet. As of last July, there were 176 countries that had become signatories to it. Seems like in the beginning there was like 109 or something like that. So now one part of this convention or this treaty is international ISPM 11, which has to do with phytosanitary measures. International Standards for Phytosanitary Measures, number 11. It talks about pest risk analysis for quarantine pests. And I think the iteration I have read is from 2004. And it actually has guidelines for conducting these pest risk analyses. And it's all based on the fact that something is known to be a problem for somebody, somewhere, either in an agricultural setting or in a natural setting. It's either not in your country, or if it's here, it can be eradicated. This is the main reason why kudzu is never going to be listed as a quarantine significant pest in the United States. Now, it could be a quarantine significant pest in the state of Kansas under Kansas law if the people wanted to try to eradicate it, if it can be eradicated from that state. So that's really the basis of all this. So the principles of pest risk analysis. So basically you identify and evaluate some kind of pest of concern like Asian longhorn beetle right here, and you figure out how it might get here, such as lumber coming in from Russia into the West Coast. So the next thing you want to do as part of that process is to see, okay, you've got a pest, you've got a vector. So what's that risk here? And in this case, I thought that it'd be interesting to think about the U.S. hardwood forests in the central United States, right here. Central hardwood forests. That's what's at risk. If we bring these things in without really thinking about it, and that lumber is not been heat treated or fumigated or something like that, then you could well have this insect in it, and maybe that lumber goes to the central U.S. and then you've got another outbreak. That's exactly what has happened with the Asian longhorn beetle coming into the New York area to begin with, and later into Illinois around Chicago in the mid to late 1990s. But in that case, I think it was because it was in solid wood packing. It really wasn't a commodity. It was that it was crates that they brought machinery and other things in. So if you're looking at it, actually packaging itself or a commodity like lumber, if they are raw materials and have not been fumigated or heat treated or something to make sure there's no pests in them, can be just as much of a problem. So then you've got to figure out what are your conditions of entry. And this is going to vary tremendously. But I know that I think in the mid-90s they recognized that solid wood packing was a huge problem. And I know that in my career as an inspector, I spent a lot of time digging wood-boring insects out of solid wood packing. And the other thing, though, I will say is even if you have certification that these commodities and their packaging has been treated according to international standards, you still have to inspect it. And I'm sure they still do, the agricultural inspectors in the Port of Wilmington and Charleston and everywhere else. Because we used to get commodities in such as guar gum and cotton piece goods from India. And we would have all kinds of certificates saying they had been fumigated. But we could go out there and find capra beetle in the Port of Charleston, either in the wood staves on these containers of cotton cloth, or we could find the beetle around the edges of it in the cloth itself. Even though the certificate said that it had been fumigated, all that means is they fumigated it and put it back in a infected warehouse or infested warehouse. So you never can let your vigil down and use these conditions of entry to say, we're okay, we have solved the problem. Well, no, I think that we've created a situation that's going to minimize the problem, but there's always going to be a need for these inspectors at our ports of entry, always. I hope that that's one program that is not going to get cut as we deal with our national or federal budget issues here. Something else that's not being cut right now that I was really glad to hear about, and I hope they stick with this, is the witchweed eradication program. I was the aphis weed coordinator from 1996 to 2000 before I transferred over to the U.S. Geological Survey. But so I can understand, what they're faced with in terms of money in funding these programs like giant hogweed in New York, or Orobanche ramosa down in Texas, or hydrilla out in California. These are state and federal weed eradication programs. So what they've done is zeroed out all these things except for the witchweed eradication program. So there's no more money for federal noxious weed programs this year. They did save the witchweed eradication program because we've invested $250 million over 56 years. We're very close to the end, probably 10 to 15 more years of this. And in the end, we'll probably end up spending $300 million. But as I have said in my other webinars, this is going to mean that we have spent $300 million, but in 1 year, you could lose 3 times that amount in the state of Nebraska with just a 10% loss of your corn crop. So this is one reason I am so interested in creating links between people in Nebraska who do weed management and people in the ports of entry. They need to share information with each other, and I can tell you, ever since APHIS, the folks in the port of entry were moved over to Customs and Border Patrol, which was like 2002 or 2003, I guess, maybe 2003. I have seen one Customs and Border Patrol person at a meeting, ever. One person. And what that means to me, and now I've gone to lots of meetings, so I think if they were going to a lot of meetings, I would have at least seen them there. So what we need to do is encourage the agencies to allow their specialists, for example, like Tom Alger, to go to meetings, because it's so critical that they have a connection with these people in the national parks and the national U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so that they can work together to protect our country, our national and managed resources. So the next thing you want to do is to implement these risk management options, and so I remember as an inspector signing lots of phytosanitary certificates for lumber that came out of Tennessee. And I know you have a database now, and probably you go online and look all this stuff up in your manuals online. But what I had was a notebook with maps in it. And so we get a certificate of some lumber going to somewhere like Spain. Out of Charleston, it's going from Charleston to Spain. And under this ISPM 11, Spain being a signatory, would want to make sure that the lumber that they were getting in over there had met certain requirements, just like things we might get from Russia. And so I remember, I don't know what disease it was, but I can remember distinctly looking at this notebook and documenting, okay, this came from a county in Tennessee. say Davidson County, in Nashville, or Montgomery County in Clarksville, wherever the lumber came from. Certain counties were certified as being pest-free according to this international standard. What we were doing is certifying it was coming from there based on what the exporter told us. It was coming from an approved county in an approved state to go out of Charleston over to Spain. I always found that really fascinating, to be able to do that kind of work, because you felt like you were really contributing. Because when they would send things to us, we expected the same thing. So they would have plant quarantine inspectors in Spain, theoretically doing the same thing for commodities there that would come to us. I know it happened with meat. I can remember distinctly we had a section of APHIS devoted entirely to food inspection. I don't know what the name of that section is now. It could be actually a different section of USDA. But I remember they spent all day long just dealing with phytosanitary certificates for meat coming into the United States. So that's what we're talking about. So just wanted to illustrate it here with the kind of lumber that we would get in on trailers. So there's really nothing for me to see on this lumber. I wasn't going to actually inspect it for insects or diseases. I was really interested in the paperwork that came along with it. So anyway, the overview of the pest risk analysis process, there's really three main steps. That's to initiate the pest risk process by identifying the pests and the pathways of quarantine concern for the specific area, either your domestic area or the area in some other country where a commodity is going. Step two is to conduct the pest risk assessment, and you categorize the individual pests to determine if they're quarantine significant. And what that means is that if the vector or either the species itself is determined to be invasive, number one. Number two, is it in our country? Number three, if it is here, can it be eradicated? And then you do a probability of estimated probability of, will it come here, will it get established, will it spread, and what would be the economic and environmental consequences. Step three would be, okay, now that you know the potential problem, what are you going to do about it? So you're going to identify, evaluate, and select management options for reducing identified risk in the conditions of entry. For example, heat or steam treatment or fumigation for imported logs. If you've got trees coming in the country, you want to do something to make sure they don't have any insects or diseases in it, because that is exactly why we have laurel wilt disease spreading up and down the southeastern coast of the United States. Come in the port of Savannah in 2002, and solid wood packing from China. That insect ambrosia, red ambrosia beetle, one of 10 or 12 they had intercepted in the past, not much of a problem. They decided it was not quarantine significant, so they said we're not going to worry about it. So happened that particular species of beetle had a fungus associated with it, which you can look this up and find out more details about it, but it's laurel wilt disease, and it's killing all of our red bay trees. From red bay grows from Charleston, from Delaware all the way down to Mississippi. And so if you look at a range map of red bay tree right now, you're going to see where it grows. It's sort of in the coastal plain area of the coastal areas of the southeastern United States, all the way to Mississippi, down in Florida and everything. And I want you to look at that, because this is an insignificant tree in terms of timber or something like that. But it's a native species that is going to go extinct because our system did not accommodate those kinds of insects and potential pests that may cause problems. And so this reminds me of what happened with the chestnut blight 100 years ago, when they brought in Chinese chestnuts, which themselves are not a problem, but had the Chinese chestnut blight associated with them, which of course killed one of our major timber trees, the American chestnut. Same thing is happening right now as we speak with laurel wilt disease. And it really gets to me to do this kind of work and know that here all around me, the red bay trees, I see them on the side of the road or in the edge of the woods, they're all dying. And everything else is green, and you see a dead tree standing there, and you know exactly how it happened. And of course, people ride by, they see it, and they don't even notice that that tree is dying. But like I said, it's not a timber tree, so it's insignificant from an economic standpoint. But from an ecological standpoint, the Palomito swallowtail butterfly is all going to go extinct too, because it eats the leaves of the red bay tree when it's a caterpillar. That's all it eats. Anyway, so I want to finish up today by talking about the prohibited listing approaches. There's really two of them. You've got the prohibited approach, prohibited listing approach, in which you assess and list high-profile invasive species that meet IPPC criteria as quarantine significant pests. The second approach is the permitted listing approach, which is where you assess all species coming in the country to determine if they should be officially listed. It's sort of like putting up a yield sign to say, are we going to list it? So right now that means that anything that comes into the United States except plants for planting, which is something new, if it's not already regulated, it can come right on in. Under the permitted listing approach, anything that is not already in Australia, which is where this system was developed, they say, wait a minute, let's see if this is going to be a problem. And they may well decide to let it come in the country. But at least they look at everything to say, is it here? Has it been a problem? Do we have it regulated already? Should we regulate it? And I'm sure that most of these things go right on through the system. So anyway, the prohibited listing approach is has a number of steps involved. So you've got proposed exotic species that meet the criteria as a quarantine significant pest. So they're officially listed and prohibited entry into the country. And this would be something like Mediterranean fruit fly. Then you have imported exotic species that have not been assessed, but they harbor prohibited pests themselves. And this would be something like wheat that's infected with carnal bunt. And I remember in my career, carnal bunt was early in my career, carnal bunt was something they talked about all the time. We got to be really careful bringing wheat in the country. Wheat was not the issue, it's what wheat would bring into the country. Then if you knew where the wheat was coming from and it could be declared pest-free, of course, that's fine. So wheat is not an issue. It's that wheat coming from a place like India is, because that's where carnal bunt grows right now. And they know the world distribution of it. So if you have wheat coming from an area where carnal bunt is known to occur now, you're not going to get your wheat in this country because the wheat may have carnal bunt in it. Then we got imported cargo that may harbor prohibited pests. So in this case, if you find something, you got to inspect it. If you find a prohibited pest, you've got to treat it some way. Then if you have an imported cargo that is not otherwise prohibited and you don't find anything, you inspect and release it. So this is the prohibited listing approach. The listing process for this is long and tedious. Species not on the list can enter unless they're prohibited under some other regulation. Most of these lists have focused traditionally on excluding pests of agriculture and rangelands. However, many of our plant pests, the forests and other natural areas, are not pests of agriculture. Laurel wilt disease is a great example of that, because the disease itself is never going to cause problems for most of our crops, and so they normally wouldn't worry about it. But what's interesting is it's turned out that laurel wilt disease is a big threat to avocado production in South Florida. So avocados are closely related to red bay trees in the same family. And so we are getting some help actually from the avocado industry supporting researchers to try to find a way to treat these trees and protect them from laurel wilt disease, which is spread by this beetle. And so it could be that we may find an effective treatment that is cheaper than one we do have. We do have a treatment that is about $500 per tree per year. So that means if you want to save a tree, you've got to inject an insecticide, fungicide into this thing to kill the beetle and the fungus. So how many of these things can we save? And I can only think of one red bay tree they might try to save, and that is the champion red bay tree that's down in Charleston, South Carolina. So on James Island, it's the biggest red bay tree in South Carolina they know about. It actually was there during the Revolutionary War. It was there during the Civil War. It's a historic tree because actually they fired the first shots of the Civil War from really close to where this tree grows. So it's a historic site, and they want to preserve as much as they can from around that tree in that area on that island. And so it's infected with laurel wilt disease right now, and they've been trying to treat it, and the limbs keep dying, and I hope they save it, or it's going to go, it's going to die too. The prohibited listing system presumes that most major pests are likely to be imported have been identified and listed. And I would say that is not true. Based on my experience in dealing with weeds, at least from a plant perspective, we have many, many thousands that we have not regulated entry into this country. So a case study would be prohibited listing system with the U.S. Federal Noxious Weed List. So to do this kind of assessment, you want to know about the identity of the proposed species you want to list, the world distribution, the quarantine pest status, establishment potential in the U.S., spread potential after establishment, potential economic impacts, on down the list, potential environmental impacts. Then you get a cumulative score, and then a likelihood of introduction, then an estimate of the pest risk potential. This is the old system that APHIS used to use, and I have not used their new system, but apparently they have developed a new system which I'm going to look at soon to try to integrate the new system, which I think is more like the permitted listing system with where you give a score and you have a number of questions and you come up with a cumulative score. So I did this for beech vitex in 2005 and 2006. Beech vitex is one of our new invasive plants that was introduced into North Carolina and South Carolina in 1985 by the NC State Arboretum, and it's been spreading ever since then, where it's now a threat to dune plants and animals and sea turtle nesting. So we established a task force in 2003, and we've almost eradicated this from the Carolinas now. There is some of it in North Carolina. We've almost finished eradicating it in South Carolina. So based on my risk assessment that I started in 2005, this is the score I came up with, and you would think with everything else that this could be listed as a federal noxious weed, no problem. But it turned out that there's some publications from Hawaii that list this as a native plant, which I think is insane to think that beech vitex can be native to Hawaii and Korea at the same time. So maybe someday we will actually revisit that and say you can't declare something. It may have been in Hawaii for a long time, but that doesn't mean it's native to there. So it was not listed because it is said to be in some formal literature to be native to Hawaii, which is absolutely not true, but in literature it says it is. The permitted listing system, the guiding principle is that you assess all species proposed for importation to determine that they should be officially listed. So we're talking about species that are assessed and determined to be non-quarantine significant, or species that are assessed and determined to be quarantine significant. So you end up with a permitted list, in other words, things that are not quarantine significant that you can bring in, and then you come up with a prohibited list. So you still have a prohibited list to guide you. you're just going to look at everything to determine what should be on that prohibited list. So this is a pretty good system. I really like this system. It has 49 questions. These are the kind of things that they ask you on there. This is the guy who developed it. His name is Paul Fallon, and he's with AQUIS, which is comparable, which is the counterpart to APHIS in the United States. He's in Canberra, down in southeastern Australia. He came out with this questionnaire, and it's not really easy to read this, but it's really a single page, and you answer these questions here, such as naturalized beyond the native range, and you get a score. And you have another addition, another page will tell you how much to score each one, yes or no, like 0 or 1. Produces viable seeds, like score 0 or 1. And then you come up with a score, and that will tell you if it's like less than 1, then you accept it. So it's a pretty strict way of looking at things. I think it's worked really well for them. And the good news is, several years ago, APHIS decided to use a system like this in the plants for planting quarantine, which is quarantine 37. So anything that comes in the country now that is considered plants for planting has to be assessed to determine if it should be regulated. And they've actually got a good list to start with in terms of plants, because, and that would be the global compendium of weeds. And so anybody that wants to do that kind of work now, I think that should be on your shelf, definitely on your computer. Like I said, it's probably about 1,200 pages now. He keeps adding to it all the time. And so I remember in 2000 when we first helped him in USGS, where I worked after APHIS, we actually helped him publish the first edition of this thing. And at that time, he had 22,000 species. Now he has 33,000 species listed in it. So he's continuing to add to it. So that's going to do it for today. I want to encourage you to join us for our last 2 webinars of this series, which started in January. Session 5 of our early EDR webinar series will be on April 23rd. And then session 9 of our obvious prevention webinar series is the summary and review of everything we've talked about for the last over 2 months. Is foreign pest exclusion as a major element of a national invasive species prevention strategy. And this is where we tie it all together and we talk about obvious prevention, foreign pest exclusion at ports of entry, and EDR. This is where I'm hoping we can make a connection with the people who are doing this kind of work together so they can work together.